Welcome to the Maintainable Software Podcast, where we explore the art of improving existing software with seasoned practitioners who have helped organizations work past the problems often associated with technical debt and legacy code. I'm your host, Robby Russell. On this episode, Urban Hafner joins us from Munich, Germany. Urban is a senior software developer at Risk Methods and the co-host of the podcast Expanding Beyond. Urban Hafner, we're so glad to have you join us on Maintainable. Welcome.
Well, thank you for having me.
So as you reflect on your experience in our industry, what do you believe are a few common characteristics of, dare I say, well-maintained software?
Yeah, that's a interesting question. And after listening to a few episodes, what I came up with was basically well-maintained software is software that is maintained. A bit of a tautology, I would say, but to me, it's what it boils down to. If you spend some time, all the time, looking after your code base, I mean, it's probably not going to fix everything, but it's already going to make matters much better than if you just develop your new features and leave everything the way it was before, and then you end up with a huge mess, and then you need to spend all the time cleaning it up.
What are some characteristics of a messy code base where that hasn't been taken care of? Is it just that they never spend time on any cleanup type tasks or maintenance type tasks?
Yeah, it's also, I think, maybe that's just a recency bias. What I've seen recently is basically well-intentioned problems, and what I would call it is that you realize that the old way of doing something, some, I don't know, service object or whatever process you used wasn't really working, and you come up with the new shiny way of doing stuff. And then obviously you're not going to finish it and redo everything. And then you do that a few times in a row, and then you end up with, 5-6 different ways of doing the same things. And then no one really knows what to expect anymore. And you spend a lot more time trying to actually understand, because you sort of jump from one way of doing things to another way along the way.
In your experience, have you seen that happen a lot because of just team attrition, people coming and going from a team? Or have you seen that often show up where it's like very much the same few people working on the software project, yet they're kind of working on new things and new shiny approaches and patterns, but never going back? Or has it been a bit of both?
Yeah, probably a bit of both, but the first one is probably the bigger one. That's true. Yeah. If the person sort of that came up with the way is actually leaving, then no one knows anymore what it was supposed to look like, and there's no one, sort of no guardian, I guess, that can look after the stuff.
I think that's one of the things that I think a lot of the types of companies that my company helps with provides. We're a consulting business, and so companies come to us, they're like, there's often a lack of context because those original people are no longer around, or someone came in and maybe they'll speak about a software developer who knew everything or had everything in their head, or they documented when they left and go get a new job or something, but there's still like this lack of like persistent context about why things were done the way they were and why they use certain patterns. So sometimes it can be difficult to go into those environments and say, well, this is an interesting pattern. Why did they go down this path? And you kind of don't necessarily fully wrap your head around it. Do you have a lot of experience joining projects where there is the kind of, where you've seen it done well, where there was a lot of good, you were able to wrap your head around the context due to, I don't want to kind of say why, but like maybe things like documentation, or just it was very clear to you?
Yeah, I mean, a bit of an unfair example. The one case where it actually worked well was where there was a startup. One of the founders was actually the CTO who started writing the code, and he just stayed on, right? And then you always have that one person who can maybe not writing the code day to day anymore, but he's sort of still having an eye on it. And then you can actually see that it might not be perfect, but at least there's a certain style to it, and it's much easier to follow what's going on.
So maybe there's an argument for having a technical co-founder that is never allowed to leave, for a business to be, for the other people to be able to come in and be able to have access to them.
Yeah. I mean, the other side is obviously having basically no technical founder, and then you have some agency build the first prototype for you, and then it's of course never a prototype but the actual application.
No.
And then you those people obviously leave eventually, and oftentimes there's no real handover, and then you end up with the situation like we talked about, that you don't really have anyone to ask how to do stuff in which style, and then you sort of deteriorates in that way.
It's very true. It's interesting. For a long time, our company did a lot of like projects with startups, and admittedly, one of the reasons we stopped doing that work, because we didn't get to keep those clients for a really long time, because most startups, don't succeed in finding like a good product market fit. And so I like to describe myself as a very lazy salesperson for being a consultancy. So I want to work with companies that have been around for 2 to 5+ years, have budget, understand like that there's long-term support and maintenance. And I know there's a lot of agencies out there that have their teams are really good at maybe spinning up those initial MVPs for projects, and will help ship that and maybe provide support for a year or two. But then a couple of years after they've launched it, they start to be like, well, we want to work with other new projects on the new thing, not be the ones taking care of the day-to-day support. So that's where I kind of like my company comes into play. I'm curious, like, as you mentioned, have you actually ever worked in like a agency type role yourself?
Sort of. I was freelancing for a while, so I hopped from project to project. So, but I think both approaches are valid, and I guess you're just optimized for something else, right? For as a startup, I guess it is fine that you just cut corners all the time, because you need to get something out, and the money is not limitless. And then if you succeed and need to rewrite it, then that just means you made it, right? So in a sense, it's a good problem to have.
Right.
Compared to the other 99% of startups that never make it.
What's your take on the metaphor technical debt? Do you use it on a regular basis in your day-to-day work?
Not as a term. As a concept, sure. You always have to weigh your options. Do I really now need to build the perfect solution? Do I even know what it is sort of the other question to ask there. Or is it fine to just say, hey, for the time being, we're just gonna do the thing, the smallest thing possible. Might not be perfect, but it's what we need now. And I would say it's not a term I use anymore, but it's sort of ingrained in all decision making, I would say.
Did you use it in the past, and do you feel like your understanding of the term changed as you would, kind of grew in your career?
I would say so, yeah. I think the change isn't necessarily of... I think my biggest change was sort of once I transitioned to being a manager, when you sort of see it from the other side, where you say, hey, it might be nice to build a perfect, shiny technical solution, but on the other hand, we actually need to ship something, and we have some kind of business value to provide. And then sometimes it is actually beneficial to say, hey, we're going to release that now, and it's going out, and hopefully we're going to make some money, and then afterwards we have more time to actually look into it and fix it.
That makes a lot of sense. You mentioned kind of the manager path, and that's one of the topics I wanted to dig in with you. So let's get into that now. I know that you, through your career journey, you navigated from being a programmer and then went down the path and became a manager, and you've since decided to go back to being an individual contributor programmer. What did you learn through that experience?
I got into a manager in a startup to sort of the management role because, well, there was no one, right? There was the CTO, and then there were the programmers, and I wanted to have this engineering manager, and I thought, hey, it's a startup, I can maybe try that. I was sort of interested in understanding more about team dynamics and all that stuff after having, I don't know, maybe not exhausted all the technical things to learn, but it wasn't that interesting anymore. And sort of I tried to broaden my horizon there. Sort of what I learned about myself personally is that I'm not a good manager. So there's obviously, in hindsight, it's a completely different skill set that you have to have. Being a programmer, you're very analytical, and you have to sort of figure out all the details and stuff like that to program. But as a manager, you're more sort of, there's more of a human side, right? And that was what was difficult for me. But on the other hand, it was actually nice to sort of, as they call it, be in the room and sort of see more of the whole process of, hey, there's a feature we maybe want to build this year strategically, and then you have to figure out where does it fit in, can we even do it, and sort of that part, which I guess these days gets sometimes put into staff engineer roles as well. That's sort of the interesting part to me.
So at that moment that you became a manager, there was a void in the team right at that point. There was maybe a new position, or someone is like, okay, we have a handful of several software engineers. Someone needs to kind of oversee this because maybe the CTO in that company didn't have the capacity to do that, or maybe it didn't play to their strengths or something like that. And as someone that I run a company, and I definitely been in a similar situation where I was like, I can't be the day-to-day manager for everybody. And so it was like, well, who's someone on my team, in the software team, that I trust? Like, I don't have to think about managing them that much. I'm like, oh, what if I offer that role to them? Maybe they could do that, but missing the mark on the, oops, that person is a really good software developer. What does it take to be a good manager of software developers? It's a completely different thing. It doesn't mean necessarily like pick the software developer that you rely on or trust, like maybe a little bit more than some of the other people that are maybe a little younger in their earlier on in their career or something. Was that kind of like a similar type of situation for you?
Yeah, I mean, in that team, I basically ran most things. Like, it was a Scrum team, and I was sort of the unofficial Scrum Master in the end. And I did a lot of team activities and stuff like that. And still, I wasn't, or at least didn't feel I was a good manager then. So it is sometimes it's hard to say if you're a good fit or not, I think.
That's true. I think if you're got some of those, if you're a good facilitator of, conversations or activities within a team or ceremonies in like a Scrum process, sometimes did you intentionally like, oh, I'm going to do that? Or like when you were kind of leading like the Scrum, being like the Scrum Master, were you doing that because it felt like there was a void, or you just kind of like, did you kind of just nominate yourself, or did the team all be like, please, Urban, you do this?
I sort of volunteered myself, I guess. I just wanted to figure out all that stuff out. And I thought it would be a sort of a logical progression to try to be the manager. But then it's still different, right? The Scrum is there's still some kind of framework, or any agile process. There's some framework and sort of guidelines around which stuff is working. But then when you're a manager of people, then there's basically, right, you have to deal with people one-on-one, right? You have to figure out how they're doing and how you can help them and stuff like that. And that's turned out wasn't my best. Wasn't that good at it.
I appreciate you sharing this with us and our listeners. I sometimes wonder if there's this illusion that, depending on how large of a team it is, people are on as well, but might be this illusion that if you become a manager, you're going to get to be in those key conversations earlier on with other people in the business. So it's not just necessarily the, I get to manage, and now I'm going to, hire and fire people on my team or whatever. I'm going to build the best possible team that we can, but actually that I can be part of a conversation about the product or the software that we're working on earlier on, so that I'm not kind of like too far downstream. Have you experienced that at all? Do you feel like there's any merit to that?
Yeah. And I mean, I guess this is where this formalization of staff engineer and stuff like that in some companies comes from, because that's again more technical, and I guess this is sort of more of a natural progression of a developer to sort of maybe still not write a lot of code, but still stay more on the technical side, and then you still don't manage people and you're not dealing with that too much, but you're sort of more playing to your strength there. Still more communication with other people, but it is sort of not still sort of not your responsibility, right?
I was just reading or I can't say that I read the whole article, but I was skimming an article like maybe 2 hours ago, and I need to go find it. But there was an article about something about around the staff engineer, and it being, sometimes people think of it as like, oh, you're you fill in gaps as a staff engineer. You're there to solve problems or help solve problems or like connect systems or people together, like understanding. You're kind of floating a little bit in some ways in your work. As I was saying, like for those listening, could you offer them any advice on things they should be considering if they are to go down the path of, they want to go down the path of management or stay an individual contributor? What sort of questions should they ask themselves as they're kind of navigating that thought in their head?
I mean, the big thing to remember is that this is a completely different job, right? If you've sort of started out as a junior engineer and you're sort of progressing, you're getting better at stuff, and you're sort of really you're sort of at the end of the journey. But then sort of if you then move into management, you're starting at the bottom again, right? The thing to remember there is, do you really want to do that once more, right? And then it's a completely different skill set, of course, and you need to figure out if this is even something you want to do or if you're good at. I probably should have listened to my wife and not tried it, but now I know for sure that this is not something I want to do. Yeah, and then it's sort of the question, either you do that or you figure out if there's companies where you can sort of progress in a way of saying, hey, now I might not be just a developer that works on a team, but maybe I support multiple teams, and you sort of stay on a technical side and progress there instead of sort of resetting your career in a way, even though it doesn't look like on the CV.
Right. I think it's interesting where, depending on the opportunities that your current employer can provide, there's like, if there's nobody else, like say above a senior level developer yet, because they haven't created another tier in their matrix of, there's a staff engineer or principal engineer. I don't know how long these titles have been around in the industry off the top of my head. I don't remember them 10, 15 years ago necessarily, but it doesn't mean, but I also remember there was an era where I worked where there were like numbers at the end of, like, it was software engineer, like a level 3. And like, it was just like these level numbers, like you're somehow being promoted that way. Curious, like for people that are like in smaller organizations and they're feeling like, oh, well, if I don't become the manager, there's really no other way to grow. And I don't know if that's always true or not, but so I wonder if sometimes that becomes like if I can't become a manager, then I'm going to go find a job elsewhere where I have more opportunities.
But I mean, on the other hand, if you're working at a startup, I think that's sort of the perfect environment to actually try it out. And I did it for 6 months, and then I said to my boss, hey, I'm not good at this. I want out in a way. In the end, I did it for about a whole year until they found a replacement. And I guess it hasn't hurt my career. So it's something you try and you sort of see it a bit from the other side. And then if you ask many people, they say it's probably good to actually understand the rest of the organization a bit better and how that actually works, instead of being just a developer and then complaining about the rest of the company in a way. How it kind of happens too often, I guess.
And so in that scenario, you were able to kind of roll back or pivot within the same organization and not necessarily need to just like, I guess I need to go find a new job now because that didn't quite pan out the way that I hoped it would. That's good. I think if if the listener is going into those sorts of situations, I think it would have been interesting, because I've had people ask when we're like, oh, we're going to hire an engineering manager. And some people said, oh, I want to apply for that position. And I'm like, well, are you sure? Like, you want to do that? But then, I think having conversation of being like, well, this could be, let's try this out for 3-6 months or something like that. Let's experiment with this. It's this isn't a forever decision we're making. So that way the rest of the team knows that we're going to reassess this. And then if we will treat this like it's okay if we don't think this makes sense for this person to keep going, if they don't feel like they'd be successful. But it also is an interesting thing where you become a manager of your coworkers, probably, and then to them to have that experience as their manager. Was that an awkward transition or did it kind of work out itself way more easier than you thought it would?
Yeah, that worked out fine. I mean, on the way back, I sort of moved into a different team.
There's a trick.
So then that sort of seemed like the more awkward transition, but in the end, it was all fine. No problem there.
All right, so there's a secret sauce. Just find a different team within the organization. That's interesting. So another topic that I wanted to cover with you is that because you also are a co-host of a podcast, Expanding Beyond. Firstly, was being a podcast host on your career bucket list?
No, not really. I just stumbled upon it in one of my hobbies, and then it sort of stuck. And I thought, hey, maybe I can do one about programming it as well. And then
I can appreciate that. So, what topics are you and your co-host Monica primarily focusing on?
Yeah, so Monica is actually an engineering manager. She was also a developer. She made the transition and stayed there, I guess. So we've, like a lot of those two-person shows where we don't interview many people, we sort of talk about whatever came up in the recent times in our jobs. With her being a manager and me being a bit more interested in organization and not so much anymore into technical topics, that's sort of what we cover. Hey, how can agile processes help you? There's some kind of big bang migration somewhere happening. Is that a good idea? How can you smooth it out by some, I don't know, processes like rehearsing the migrations and stuff like that? That's sort of what we cover. But essentially it is us spending an hour talking about work every week or every 2 weeks, and then other people can listen in as well, I guess.
And I'm curious, how has starting a podcast like helped you on a day-to-day level of your work?
Sometimes it's nice to actually to talk about stuff with someone, right? It's not just having it in your head or talking to your other half who is probably not a programmer, and it's nice to have someone outside to spitball and discuss these things. I think that actually helps to have an outside perspective to say, hey, that's good. Maybe that part isn't as bad as you think it is. Maybe you should calm down or something.
It's interesting because I know you're doing in the format of you two talking together and not maybe interviewing like guests at this point. And I took the path of going on the guest path because I admittedly was just like, well, I could be super selfish and just get to talk to a lot of really cool, interesting people. And I get to learn a little bit from everybody on a regular basis. I don't know that I think that I've had some consistent conversations with anyone in particular off the top of my head that like, oh, I should hit the record button and record us chatting about this topic every week or something, or talking about something related to what we're doing every week. I feel like that actually, to what you're doing, actually it intimidates me a little bit more than even when I'm, the way that I'm approaching my podcast. Because I'm like, what do I have to say? Occasionally I get to inject my commentary into these conversations, and I think there's probably definitely some threads there that people could pull from to know enough about my opinion about things. But I don't know that I could just hit the record button and just start talking about a topic. So I commend you for that.
Yeah, somehow we manage to find a topic almost every time, and then we just start.
For those also for our listeners that might be contemplating the idea of starting their own podcast, do you have any advice you could offer them on how to go about doing that?
Yes.
Outside of the the obvious topics related to like the type of microphone and like those types of things, like the other things that maybe aren't super obvious from the outside.
So what's actually intimidating me is what you are doing, because having to deal with people with suspect recording equipment every time. I did a different podcast and we had more guests there, so not technical, and this was always a struggle to get decent audio quality. I mean, these days it's actually not hard. What we are using is one of those browser services where you basically connect both, and then it records there as separate tracks, and it's easy to edit. I mean, that's sort of the big thing you have to keep in mind. The big amount of work is actually the editing afterwards. It sort of depends on how much work you want to put in, how clean it needs to be. Do you want to remove all the awkward pauses and stuff like that? And then editing can take, I don't know, a lot of time. So by now we are using an editor, a friend of mine who's giving us a good rate, so we can pull it off. But I did it myself in the past, and I know I wouldn't have kept doing it, because that is a lot of work to get it right.
It is. When we when I proposed doing this podcast with within my company and talking to my business partner, a couple other people, I knew that was going to be like a huge challenge. I'm like, all right, well, not just the interviewing and the audio quality of guests, that definitely is that is very much a challenging thing at times, especially when you can't really do anything about it. And you're like, this is maybe the only chance to get to talk to this person. I'm crossing my fingers that the audience forgives us for allowing a couple of those episodes get through from time to time. But especially when there's people fidgeting at their desk and then their little things are just like things you kind of hope aren't being picked up on their microphone. Anyhow, but when we went into the process, I was like, we need to find an editor that can just take care of all that, take care of the audio stuff to the best that we can do and find like a consistent, reasonable rate. So we found an editor off of an online directory, and this is the 123rd episode I'm recording. So he's done every single one. I've only listened to one of them, with the very first one, before it got published. I haven't bothered to listen to any of them until after they're published since then, which has been pretty awesome that I can just like, they understand it. They're really good at what they do. I don't want to learn how to be an editor myself. That's like, I knew that wasn't going to pan out, and this project would have stopped pretty quickly, I think. Were you concerned at all about how many episodes you would queue up before you kind of announced it to anyone, or did you just kind of like go for it from episode one?
No, we are not that organized. It's still like we don't even have a backlog, right? We just or a runway. It's like now someone's on holiday or someone is sick, then it's then a longer break. But if it's just something fun for you and you have some people listen to it, then it's fine. And I guess, I mean, for us, it is not that we want to really grow it and have a huge audience. It's just we want to have fun. And then if other people listen to it, then that's cool too.
We'll be back with our interview with Urban in just a moment. Hi, it's me, Robby. I just wanted to take a quick moment to say thank you for making time to listen to the Maintainable Software Podcast. If you're finding these conversations valuable, please consider sharing a link amongst your peers and or writing a review on Apple Podcasts or rating us in the Spotify app, which is something I noticed you could do a couple hours ago. Also, do you know someone in the industry that I should be interviewing on Maintainable? Shoot me an email to Robby with a Y at maintainable.fm and state your case. And now, let's get back to our interview with Urban Hafner. I was having a conversation at a conference last week I was on a panel with about 5 different podcasts and it was for a Ruby on Rails conference here that was in Portland, Oregon last week. And we were talking, and people were talking about how a lot of them are talking, or new features in the frameworks or trends in the industry. And I was like, well, I'm actually taking a very different approach where I want to talk with a lot of different people around very, very similar topics related to just taking care of existing code, long-term software maintenance type tasks. Because I thought that when I created this podcast idea, I was like, I want something where if I have a conversation with someone like you, Urban, where like in 5 years, you can listen to it again and be like, still holds value today because it's not outdated content. It just was that person at that point in time reflecting on where they are at that point in their career. And all of the episodes, for the most part, aren't trying to talk about like these new technology stacks or anything like that. And so I'm like, these are persistent topics that I feel like could be valuable to myself to listen to in like 10 years from now, let alone maybe be able to have that be something that other people could find some value in as well.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, new technologies are only interesting, I guess, in the immediate future. 15 years ago, I mean, I did start with Ruby on Rails, my career, and I'm still doing it, but eventually I guess we will all move on to the next thing. I mean, maybe Ruby on Rails will be the next COBOL then. I don't know, or Shopify will be around forever.
Yeah, I hope so. I think it seems to be very much helping the community for sure.
What I meant there is that what you talk about and what we also try to talk about is more the I don't know, the long-term stuff, right? I mean, maintainable software, it doesn't really matter what technology it is, right? It matters how you structure it, what you do and how you do it and how the organization functions to make it actually work.
I want to take a quick pivot back to earlier. I know that you maybe don't use the term technical debt often, but for maintenance type work, do you has your team found good patterns for how to allocate time and put energy into dealing with some of those maintenance type tasks that need to take place from time to time?
So in my team, we are kind of lucky that we are sort of splitting out part of the monolith that the company has into something new. And we're sort of building in all this maintenance and rewriting work in there to say, hey, we're not going to take the existing code and move it out because it's like 5-6 years old. Some of the stuff that I wrote in the beginning. And now we know much better what it should look like, and we're going to rewrite it. We are sort of adding new features in, but we are also taking the extra time to sort of put it on a good foundation so that it is more maintainable. That's sort of the approach we are taking here. Yeah, I haven't had good experiences with sort of the style of tickets that do some refactoring or some cleanup. Oftentimes they don't really get prioritized. So in my career, I've most of the time just snuck it in, basically. Hey, there's one, here's the feature and here's the second PR or something where I do some cleanup in around that area. Also not true. So in this team, we also do some tickets that do cleanup, but they are sort of intentionally very, very small. So then it's say, hey, 1 or 2 in a sprint we can do because they don't take up a lot of time. But when you do that consistently for months and months, then it actually moves the needle.
Interesting. Are there any like data metrics that your team tracks that kind of measure how long it takes for your build to run, or those types of metrics, things like that you pay attention to related to the software delivery cycle that you kind of keep an eye on and be like, oh, this is starting to slow down and we need to speed something up. That's not necessarily like just like a request on like a web page or something.
Yeah, not for this team, because like I said, it's half a year, 9 months old Rails project. So it's like continuous delivery and pretty fast. And there's like test suite that takes 2 minutes to run or something. So not there. But the monolith that is kind of problematic. That's almost 10 years old now. And it was written without any tests in the beginning, like built by an agency. It needed to have a prototype to show it to a customer. And we're sort of still fighting with it because even after 10 years, there's still a lot of manual testing going on to make sure that it actually works. Because it's the danger of adding tests after the fact that you then still end up with a system that is so tangled that a change in one area can sort of break stuff in the other. And there we are sort of trying to move away. And I think that it would probably be valuable to sort of keep track of how often do you release and how long do those releases take and stuff like that. But we're not there yet. Let's see.
Okay. As you're kind of untangling that monolith and sounds like maybe rewriting or migrating, are there any patterns that your team is finding some success with there outside of it, or are you just building a like for like application over a site, or you're putting microservices into play or something there?
Patterns. I don't know. I think for us, the big thing is to actually understand what the system is doing before doing anything. That's a hard problem in itself, I would say. After 5-6 years, it becomes hard to really understand what was intentional on how the system works and what was just a side effect, and you're not sure if this is needed or not. So I think this is sort of the important part for us to understand what does the system do now, and if we redo it, is this even the way forward? Because I think that's sort of the perfect time to say, hey, if we do it this other way, then it's gives us almost the same benefits, but it's just much more simple to do. So why don't we cut this one corner and then we have a simpler system moving forward and the customers are still happy.
So let's say there's some folks that are listening who are working in maybe a rewrite isn't going to happen anytime soon in their environment. and they've joined a project in the last maybe year or two, and it's been around for a decade, let's just say approximately. And what they see is like a lot of challenges where it seems like the teams aren't prioritizing cleanup tasks. Like if someone might be pairing with someone, they're like, oh, this area is kind of weird, and they're like, oh yeah, it's like that, we'll get to that someday. And so those types of situations, what advice could you offer them on how to start, incrementally trying to move the needle in like a better direction versus just being, well, it seems like nobody here is really prioritizing that, or it doesn't seem like it's a priority of the product team, like it's not showing up on our sprints. And maybe I'm still kind of feeling new enough that I like, well, and who am I to kind of question why things are the way they are? Any advice for people like that?
Yeah, so what I found is that if you do it in small enough increments, but you're doing it steadily and all the time, I think that's the way to go. So one of the things I did on the side for one of the projects, they at some point decided to switch from Minitest to RSpec. And then when it came on, it was like 50-50, right? You had two test suites, and sometimes there was some surprising behavior because you had two setups and to initialize the tests, and then sometimes they worked differently, and it was just a big mess. And I had I wrote a small script that sort of calculated how many tests do I already have in RSpec, how many are left. And then I just, once, twice a week, I just picked one file or just one test and I rewrote it. And it took me a few months, but in the end, it was all done, right? And I think, of course, different for everyone, but for me, it sort of works well to see, hey, there's a number, it's going up. I'm doing something that helps. So for me, that was sort of the motivating thing to say, hey, it's now a week later. I compare the numbers I had last week to what I have now, and I see I moved some tests over, and I sort of improved the system. And I think that sort of can work. Obviously, product is going to say, hey, you're going to spend 2 weeks now rewriting stuff, and maybe you're going to introduce bugs, and it's going to take another week or two to fix it all. Is that really worth it? And I guess that's a valid concern. So I guess you just have to do it in smaller increments, I guess.
I think you had mentioned earlier that sometimes you just try to sneak work in. Was that something that you did it under the realm of sneakily migrating without having to share that with the product team, or was that something you gotten kind of the thumbs up to do?
I mean, that's how I thought about it in the beginning. These days, I think of it as just good development practice to sort of spend some time leaving the system cleaner than what you found it. So in a sense, yes, but it sort of depends on how you look at it, right? I mean, if you really spend the time to say, here, there's some small thing, I'm going to clean that up, and next time I do this here, then you sort of bit by bit get to some place that is better. Obviously, there are some changes that are not possible that way, but most times I think you can actually improve the system a lot by doing that consistently.
And where can listeners best follow your thoughts and find your podcast online?
Yeah, so I do have a Twitter account, but the only thing I post there is links to the podcast. So I guess the best is the podcast itself. So it's either expandingbeyond.it or just expanding beyond on any podcatcher of your choice. Excellent.
Well, it's been such a delight having you join us on Maintainable, Urban. Thank you so much for stopping by to talk shop.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Maintainability.